Thanks for coming back. So for the start of our second talk session today, we have Matt Dalgleish, who's going to present a talk, Do It Yourself, prototyping a juicy one-handed DMI in Eurorack. Although I see juicy has disappeared from your title there.
Yeah, it features, yeah.
Got it.
It messed up the slide formatting,
okay.
So it's come out for now.
Take it away, Matt. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I'm going to talk about an instrument that I developed for myself, which I've been developing new instruments for other people for about 15 years, as well as software, various kinds of hardware. And I've been primarily researching spatial audio, so this is a bit of a side project. If you are a fan of kind of early 90s music, the Breeders were a side project originally from the Pixies, so this is kind of my side project. Just to give you a little bit of useful information that kind of underpins the instrument design. So one of the things I was trying to get away from was the idea of the kind of overall perspective, the God trick, as Haraway calls it, and embrace sort of the partial perspective of situated knowledge. And I came across a paper by Macmillan as a reviewer, and Macmillan was a saxophonist who had a car accident and became an assistive DMI designer and performer. And my own perspective is kind of related, but different in that my one-handedness is congenital, so I've never played an instrument two-handed, but I have always played until now two-handed instruments. So I learned guitar after I played trumpet for about 5 years, and the difference in reception was quite marked. I could easily find trumpet lessons. For guitar, I couldn't find anyone to teach me, so I had to teach myself. Reception when playing was quite different with the guitar than it was to the trumpet, in both a positive and a negative way. And I had a short career as a session guitarist on the idea that my playing might be interesting. I was quite proficient, but it wasn't very interesting, so it didn't last very long. I could just play quite neatly in quite a two-handed sort of way, strangely. The thumb on my left elbow enabled me to play in a fairly conventional style. And so I became a designer of instruments for other people, including assistive instruments for blind, deaf, mobility impaired users for a number of years. And I started to think, really, what might an instrument for myself be like? And part of that, no one really knows what sort of what kind of underlying condition I have, but it's quite unpredictable. And I started to notice things like getting acute arthritis in my right hand. And so I wanted to sort of future-proof myself as much as anything else. Around the same time, I became involved with OMI, the One-Handed Musical Instrument Trust, as it was originally called. And so, although this was for myself, I thought perhaps some interesting things might come out of it for other people. And I think from the start, it was always going to be a departure from something which looked like a traditional instrument, played like a traditional instrument. We're very much in the realm of the social model here, perhaps like much design, but there's also some acknowledgement of the lived reality of things, like having really bad back pain this morning, you know, and not wanting to lug heavy things around at certain times, and trying to reflect that in the design. More generally, and I think because I've done everything one-handed since birth, probably until I was about 35, I didn't really consider one-handed use. I'd just done things. But depending on the population that you look at, between 2 and 52% of people have some kind of upper limb impairment. And ISM back in 2017 speculated there were around 640,000 people with some kind of upper limb impairment, whether that be temporary or permanent, functional or structural, that might want to play musical instruments but currently have difficulties finding an instrument they can play. So there are some instruments that can be played one-handed, very small number. There are other instruments that can be adapted. Omi's work quite extensively on those. And there are a few examples of what I've termed incidental fit. Someone like Tony Iommi from Black Sabbath, for instance, we have the same consultant, and he had an accident where he severed his fingertips, and he improvised some new fingertips for himself, slackened the strings, and kind of created the sound of heavy metal. But one of the things for me was that the instrument's available, whether that be the work presented at CHIME, strangely has been kind of adapted guitars as quite a focus, or outside of CHIME, didn't really reflect the sort of music I wanted to make, possibly because I've got quite strange musical tastes and interests in part. And so, rather than produce something which looks like an instrument, feels like a traditional instrument, tries to mimic conventional techniques, I tried to create something around my particular kind of musical interests, musical tastes, the kind of musical output that I wanted to make. Along the way, I wanted to try and discover what are the distinctive possibilities of one-handed use. And in terms of prototyping, I was exploring Eurorack, synthesizer modules, as a kind of prototyping medium. And in part, that was because of their juiciness, which is a term that's well established in a game context, but not really used in a music interaction context so much. Perhaps the most important part is just getting away from the idea of mimicking normal techniques, which features in a lot of the literature about one-handed instruments so far. And trying to think where we might find clues to what are the distinctive possibilities of one-handed use without frame of reference to two-handed interaction. So looking through a number of HCI papers, we've got things like surgical tool use, small-scale interaction on mobile phones, and themes such as faster interaction, less tiring interaction, less force needing to be used across a range of small-scale interfaces. And as a music technologist for some years, the kind of small-scale live sound console, primarily designed for one-handed operation, so you can do other things at the same time with things falling under the fingers. So there's not too much stretching involved. There's not too much sort of outside of the range of the single hand. So I began prototyping whilst realizing from sort of studying my interactions how important stability is to be. Depending on the size of the objects I'm interacting with, sort of keeping the thing still, keeping the interaction object from moving around, sort of frees up a wider range of interaction, which is something I hadn't even considered to date. In terms of starting the prototype, great. Very much in the middle, perhaps, of the sketch to prototype continuum proposed by Buxton. I've been quite influenced by this idea of sketching in hardware, so I'd use things like Arduino-type construction kits quite extensively. And so I thought of using Eurorack in a similar way. I've got a much larger system that I use for teaching and for soundtrack work, and so I started to use the larger Eurorack system to kind of feed smaller instrument prototypes. I like the way, not that I chuck the modules in the bin, but a certain disposability in that if something doesn't work, the modules could just go back into the larger system without any kind of cost. I didn't have any incentive to keep them. But these modules are full of juiciness. Juiciness has been dismissed as just blinking lights in a synth context, but in a game context, sort of abundant visual feedback is now well established as contributing significantly to player satisfaction and player experience, and in some very limited circumstances, perhaps to improving performance. But I wanted something that felt good to play, felt good to prototype, while still being malleable. I also wanted to focus on creating an instrument rather than just an interface, so considering sound generation and the mappings involved rather than just making a controller. And yeah, and just some of my slightly esoteric musical interests that I wanted to be reflected. As a guitarist, I used to be quite influenced by Derek Bailey, so the spicy Chinese food music, it was worrying like something I might have played on guitar earlier. Thanks. As well as the unstable live electronics of David Tudor, which you can kind of steer perhaps rather than actively control, and the kind of generative music systems that I produce for a game context in my day job, essentially. So put this system together, and it's a hybrid. Something you see more and more with synthesizers, a bit of a throwback to the earlier days of computer music. So I've got a Eurorack prototype with flexible remapping in Max, and then the system output feeds into Max, so I can have either a direct output of the synthesizer or use that as control signals for further sound generation. And yeah, it became this kind of subtractive process of taking away, getting smaller and smaller from this quite large system down to just the minimum I felt was required. And we've got to, just to give you a quick overview. So this is synthesizer controlled with a joystick, for which there's quite an established repertoire of gestures, at least, being further processed and triggering further sound generation in Max. For time, I'll just fast forward a little bit. Okay, there's a link to it in the paper because it just won't fast forward no matter what I do to it. But essentially, it's an instrument that steers a generative composition rather than having direct control. It doesn't attempt to have a one-to-one mapping. In terms of what I found that might be more broadly useful, so because of that ability to put parts back into the larger system, it functions, Eurorack functions quite well as a prototyping system. It has that quality of disposability that's recognized by people like Buxton as essential to a prototyping medium. The abundant visual feedback and being able to patch that is useful both from a control perspective with a generative system and knowing what's going on, but also adds to the feel, making the system juicier and more satisfying to play. A static patch, so I haven't changed the basic patch now for about 6 months. So I started to become better at playing the thing in a sort of instrument-like way. And I guess it's also highlighted the need to consider secondary aspects of disability when designing for particular users. Sort of one aspect is usually the focus, whereas in fact it would be remiss to not consider the other aspects. So how that instrument affects posture when using it one-handed, can it be moved around? There's a whole host of intersecting secondary aspects that haven't to date been considered in a lot of literature. If you're a one-handed musician, you can't be a one-handed musician with a bad foot also, for instance. So I think that's been maybe the most kind of interesting thing that's come out of it, thinking in a more kind of multifaceted way. Great. And with that, if anyone's got a question, I'm happy to answer it.
Sorry. Francis, I don't know where you've just gone. Oh, there you go, if you want to set up. I don't think we have any time for questions. Maybe a very, very quick one. Yes, while we're repositioning. Tiny question?
I'm really interested in this process that you were talking about simplifying the system when you had that diagram of you sort of gradually crossing out all these modules, and it'd be interesting to hear a bit more about that.
Yeah, so I started as a sculptor, originally. So like stone carving and things. And so quite a lot of my process has been subtractive, starting with something that's kind of more than is needed and trying to whittle it down to some sort of final form that's just the minimum required to do the thing in mind. So yeah, it feels a bit like stone carving, but conceptually rather than actually chipping away at material.
Thank you. All right, thanks again, Matt.
Thank you.
And definitely more time for questions.